45 warships, 18,000 miles, 7 months at sea without a single proper dockyard refit. That's what a Russian fleet is dragging into a narrow strait between Japan and Korea at the tail end of one of the longest, most miserable voyages in naval history, sailed the long way around the entire continent of Africa because a hostile Britain wouldn't let them use the Suez Canal. Their crews are sick, undertrained, and running on coal dust and rumor. Waiting for them, hidden in the mist, is a Japanese fleet that has spent months rehearsing exactly this moment, ship for ship, angle for angle, resting and drilling while the Russians were still shoveling coal by hand somewhere off the coast of Africa. Neither side yet fully grasps just how completely the next few hours are about to rewrite the balance of naval power on the planet. By the next morning, 2/3 of that Russian fleet will be sunk, captured, or scattered into internment in neutral ports. It will be, by casualty ratio, one of the most lopsided naval battles in modern history, a David and Goliath result with the geography flipped, where the technologically underestimated Asian power doesn't just beat a European empire, it annihilates its navy in an afternoon. This is the story of the Battle of Tsushima and the almost unbearably patient plan that made it possible. To understand why this battle mattered so much, you have to understand the war it was ending. In February 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur on the Chinese coast, opening the Russo-Japanese War without a formal declaration beforehand. The conflict was, on paper, wildly lopsided. Russia was one of the great powers of Europe, with a population and industrial base that dwarfed Japan's. Most Western military observers assumed Russia would grind Japan down eventually through sheer size, even if Japan won early battles. Japan's problem was time. Every month the war dragged on favored Russia, whose Pacific squadron, badly damaged and bottled up at Port Arthur, could eventually be reinforced by a second fleet sailing in from European Russia. If that second fleet, the Baltic fleet, arrived intact and combined with whatever remained of Russia's Pacific forces, Japan risked losing control of the sea lanes it needed to keep supplying its army on the Asian mainland. For Japan, stopping that Baltic fleet wasn't a strategic option among several. It was close to the only path to winning the war at all. Port Arthur itself fell to Japanese siege in January 1905, after a brutal months-long assault that cost both sides tens of thousands of casualties on land. With the Russian Pacific squadron largely neutralized or bottled up inside the harbor before its surrender, the entire weight of Russia's naval hopes in the war shifted onto a fleet that, at the time Port Arthur fell, hadn't even reached Asian waters yet. That fleet was still thousands of miles away, crawling down the coast of Africa, when the port it was supposedly sailing to reinforce had already surrendered. The Russian Baltic fleet, formerly called the Second Pacific Squadron, set sail from the Baltic Sea in October 1904 under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky. What followed was one of the strangest and most miserable voyages in naval history. Because Japan was allied with Britain, and Britain controlled the Suez Canal, Rozhestvensky's fleet was denied safe passage through the shortest route to Asia. Instead, the Russian fleet was forced around the entire southern tip of Africa, a journey of more than 18,000 nautical miles that took roughly 7 months. Coaling, the process of resupplying a steam fleet's fuel, had to happen at sea or in the ports of neutral or sympathetic nations, since British-controlled ports along the route were closed to them. Crews shoveled thousands of tons of coal by hand in tropical heat, then scrubbed the resulting black dust out of every compartment of the ship, over and over, for months. Morale collapsed. Discipline frayed. On the way out of the Baltic, jittery Russian sailors even opened fire on British fishing trawlers in the North Sea, mistaking them for Japanese torpedo boats thousands of miles from where any Japanese vessel could plausibly have been. An incident that nearly dragged Britain into the war on Japan's side. By the time the fleet finally approached Japanese waters in May 1905, it had been at sea, in some capacity, for over half a year. The ships hadn't been properly refitted in a real dockyard the entire voyage. Hull bottoms were fouled with marine growth that had accumulated over months without a proper careening, dragging down their top speed by several knots. A difference that would matter enormously once the shooting started, since a slower fleet has far less ability to maneuver out of a disadvantageous position. Ammunition reserves had been depleted through practice firing and mishandling, and much of what remained was old and unreliable. The crews, many of them reservists with limited gunnery training to begin with, hastily mobilized to fill out the fleet's numbers before departure, were physically and mentally exhausted before a single shot of the actual battle had been fired. News reached the fleet along the way that Port Arthur, the base they were originally meant to reinforce, had already fallen months earlier, meaning the entire strategic purpose of their voyage had already evaporated before they even arrived. Rozhestvensky's revised orders were simply to break through to Vladivostok as best he could, whatever that meant tactically once he got there. Waiting for them was Admiral Heihachi Togo, commanding Japan's combined fleet, and Togo had spent the better part of a year preparing specifically for this encounter. Rozhestvensky's fleet had two realistic routes to reach Vladivostok, the Russian port on the Pacific that was his ultimate destination, the Tsushima Strait, a relatively direct path between Japan and Korea, or a much longer route around the eastern side of Japan through open ocean. Togo made a calculated bet that Rozhestvensky, with his coal reserves already stretched thin after 7 months at sea, could not afford the far longer route and would be forced to take the shorter, more direct path straight through Tsushima. He deployed his scout ships and screening forces accordingly, concentrating his intelligence gathering on that single strait rather than spreading his forces thin, trying to cover every possibility. The gamble paid off almost exactly as calculated. On the morning of May 27th, a Japanese auxiliary cruiser spotted the Russian fleet moving through the strait in heavy fog and signaled the position back to Togo's main force. Togo's own flagship, the battleship Mikasa, reportedly flew a signal flag hoisted for the entire fleet to see, a message that has since become one of the most quoted lines in Japanese naval history. The Empire's fate depends on the result of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty. Togo himself wasn't a stranger to fighting the West. As a young officer decades earlier, he had studied naval science in Britain, spending years absorbing Royal Navy doctrine, gunnery methods, and shipbuilding standards at a time when Japan was rapidly modernizing its entire military along European lines. That background gave him an unusually sharp appreciation for exactly the kind of fleet he'd eventually have to defeat, because in many ways, it had been trained by the same intellectual tradition his own navy had borrowed from. He returned to Japan and rose steadily through its expanding modern fleet, and by the time the Russo-Japanese War broke out, he was already regarded as one of the most capable officers Japan had. What happened next is still studied in naval academies around the world as a textbook example of tactical execution against a numerically comparable but qualitatively inferior force. As the two fleets closed on each other, Togo executed a maneuver that carried enormous risk if timed wrong. He turned his entire battle line, ship by ship, across the projected path of the oncoming Russian column, a move that briefly exposed each turning Japanese ship to the full broadside of the entire Russian fleet, with almost no ability to fire back during the turn itself. It's the kind of maneuver that, mistimed by even a few minutes, could have handed Russia a devastating opening volley. Togo judged the range and timing precisely enough to pull it off. Once the turn was complete, his fleet was positioned in what naval tacticians call crossing the T, arranged in a line perpendicular to the Russian column, meaning every Japanese ship could bring its full broadside of guns to bear on the lead Russian ships, while most of the Russian fleet, strung out in a column behind their lead ships, could only fire the limited number of guns mounted at their bows. To picture why this mattered so much, imagine two lines of ships approaching each other. If they pass on parallel courses, each ship on both sides can generally bring roughly the same number of guns to bear on an opposing ship, a relatively even exchange, gun for gun. But when one fleet manages to turn itself so it's crossing directly in front of the other fleet's line of advance, something very different happens. The turning fleet can fire every gun on one full side of every ship simultaneously at the head of the enemy column, while the approaching fleet, still strung out in a line behind its lead ships, can only bring its forward-mounted guns to bear, often just a fraction of its total firepower, because the ships behind the leaders have no clear shot without risking hitting their own vessels. It's a geometry problem, with a devastatingly one-sided answer once it's achieved, and it's exactly why crossing the T had been a goal of naval tacticians for centuries, and exactly why almost nobody had managed to pull it off cleanly against a comparably sized enemy fleet. The tactical advantage this created was overwhelming. Japanese gunnery, better trained and using superior fire control methods for the era, concentrated devastating fire on the lead Russian battleships almost immediately, including Rozhestvensky's own flagship. Within the first 20 minutes of the main engagement, multiple Russian capital ships had already sustained crippling damage. If you're the kind of person who gets a genuine kick out of watching a well-executed plan actually pay off, hit like right about now. The next part is where it pays off in full. The battle that followed, spanning that afternoon, and into the following day as Japanese forces pursued the scattered Russian survivors, was close to a systematic dismantling rather than a conventional naval engagement. The main action opened shortly after 2 p.m., when the two battle lines came within firing range, and Togo's flagship Mikasa opened the engagement. Within the first half hour, the Russian flagship Knyaz Suvorov was already burning and steering erratically after taking repeated hits to its bridge and steering gear, effectively knocking Rozhestvensky out of active command of the battle at almost the exact moment it began, though word of his incapacitation didn't immediately reach the rest of the fleet. Without effective central direction, and under withering, accurate fire from a Japanese line that never lost its formation, the Russian column began to fragment. Battleship after battleship took on water, lost steering, or simply capsized under the weight of accumulated damage as the afternoon wore on. By nightfall, Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats swept in for a second wave of attacks against the crippled, scattered remnants of the Russian fleet, using torpedoes to finish off ships too damaged to defend themselves effectively in the dark. When the sun rose the next morning, the scale of the disaster became clear. Of the roughly 45 ships that had made that 18,000-mile journey from the Baltic, only a handful of smaller vessels, actually reached their intended destination of Vladivostok. Historical accounts place the number of Russian ships sunk, captured or forced to intern in neutral ports at around two-thirds of the fleet, including the majority of its powerful modern battleships. Russian casualties, killed and wounded combined, numbered in the thousands, with several thousand more taken prisoner. Admiral Rozhestvensky himself was severely wounded during the battle and ultimately captured when his damaged flagship was taken, spending the rest of the war as a prisoner recovering from his injuries. Japanese losses, by dramatic contrast, amounted to a handful of small torpedo boats and a few hundred casualties total. A casualty ratio so lopsided it stunned naval observers and military attachés from every major power who had been watching the war closely, expecting a far more even fight. It's worth remembering just how far this fleet had already stumbled before it ever reached the battlefield. Back in October 1904, barely a week into the voyage, jittery Russian gunners crossing the North Sea in darkness mistook a fleet of British fishing trawlers off Dogger Bank for Japanese torpedo boats. A physical impossibility, given the distance involved. But panic doesn't do geography. The Russian ships opened fire on the fishing boats, killing several British fishermen and even managing to accidentally hit two of their own cruisers in the confusion. The incident, remembered afterward as the Dogger Bank incident, nearly dragged Britain into the war against Russia and forced an embarrassed St. Petersburg to pay compensation to smooth things over diplomatically. It was an early, humiliating preview of the discipline and readiness problems that would still be haunting the fleet 7 months later at Tsushima. The consequences of Tsushima reached far beyond the waters where it was fought. Russia's defeat, layered on top of a string of costly land defeats earlier in the war, forced the Tsarist government to the negotiating table. The war ended later in 1905 with the Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by American President Theodore Roosevelt, a mediation effort that would later earn Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize. But the deeper shockwave was psychological, and it rippled through capitals that had never seriously considered an Asian power capable of this kind of decisive military dominance over a European empire. For the first time in the modern era, a non-Western nation had built, trained, and commanded a force capable of annihilating one of Europe's great power navies in open battle. It reshaped how military planners around the world thought about naval doctrine, gunnery training and fleet tactics for the following decade, and navies from Britain to Germany to the United States sent officers to study exactly what Togo had done and why it had worked so completely. The peace negotiations that followed took place not in Europe or Asia, but in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, brokered personally by American President Theodore Roosevelt, who saw an opportunity to position the United States as a rising power capable of settling disputes between empires on the other side of the world. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, forced Russia to recognize Japan's dominant interest in Korea, cede the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and hand over its lease on the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur itself. For Japan, the outcome was a genuine strategic triumph, but back home it landed with an oddly bitter aftertaste. The Japanese public, having been fed a steady diet of triumphant war reporting, expected a treaty that included a large cash indemnity from Russia, similar to what Japan had extracted from China a decade earlier. When it became clear Russia would pay nothing of the kind, riots broke out in Tokyo, a reminder that even a decisive military triumph doesn't always translate cleanly into domestic political satisfaction. Still, the war had achieved what mattered most strategically. Russia's expansion into East Asia had been checked, and Japan had established itself unmistakably as the dominant regional power. That new status came with consequences that stretched far beyond 1905. The confidence generated by victories like Tsushima fed into a steadily growing current of Japanese military assertiveness over the following decades, a belief reinforced by real results on the battlefield that Japan could match and beat Western powers through discipline, preparation, and modern technology. That same current would eventually carry Japan through the invasion of Manchuria, war with China, and ultimately into a much larger and far more devastating conflict with the United States, a war that would end very differently than this one had. It's easy to talk about Tsushima purely in terms of tonnage and casualty ratios, but inside those hulls were thousands of men who had spent the better part of a year trapped together in cramped, coal-dusted compartments, increasingly aware their commanders had no real answer for the coming battle beyond breakthrough if you can. Survivor accounts collected after the war describe a fleet that knew on some level what was likely coming. Officers reportedly held informal farewell gatherings before the battle. Sailors wrote what amounted to final letters home during the last legs of the voyage. There was no illusion among the men themselves that they were sailing toward an even fight. The exhaustion of the 7-month journey, combined with news of Port Arthur's fall reaching them along the way, had already drained away most of the confidence that might have existed at the start of the voyage back in the Baltic. For the Japanese sailors on the other side, the mood was almost the opposite. A fleet that had spent months resting, drilling gunnery crews to a level of precision that would prove decisive, and waiting with growing confidence for an enemy they had been told, accurately as it turned out, would arrive worn down and vulnerable. That psychological gap between the two fleets, as much as any individual tactical decision, shaped how the battle actually unfolded once the shooting started. Strip away the scale and the geopolitics, and Tsushima is fundamentally a story about preparation, meeting exhaustion. Rozhestvensky's fleet wasn't defeated because Russian sailors were cowardly or their ships were fundamentally inferior on paper. Several of the Russian battleships were modern, well-armed vessels. They were defeated because 7 months of grinding, demoralizing transit had already worn the fleet down to a fraction of its combat effectiveness before the first shell was fired, while Togo's forces had spent that same stretch of time resting, refitting, and drilling relentlessly for one specific encounter they were confident was coming. Togo didn't just win a battle. He won it before it started, through a level of patience and preparation that few commanders in naval history have matched, betting his entire fleet, and by extension his country's fate in the war, on a calculated read of where an exhausted enemy would be forced to go. There's also a colder, more uncomfortable lesson buried in this story, one that shows up again and again across military history. Momentum is not the same thing as strength. On paper, right up until the moment the first shells landed, the Baltic fleet was still a formidable force. Dozens of warships, real firepower, a fleet that outnumbered what Japan could put to sea. What it lacked couldn't be measured on a ship registry. 7 months of grinding transit, no functioning dry dock, degraded morale, and a strategic mission that had already collapsed before they arrived turned that formidable force into something closer to a formality. Togo understood that distinction better than almost anyone else involved in the war, and he built his entire plan around exploiting it rather than simply matching Russia gun for gun. Next up on this channel, a dictator who watched his own ally conquer half of Europe decided he needed a quick, easy war of his own to keep up, and picked a fight with a small, mountainous country that ended so badly Hitler had to personally step in and clean up the mess. Subscribe if you don't want to miss how Mussolini managed to lose to Greece. And before you go, got a theory on what would have happened if Rozhestvensky had taken the longer route around Japan instead of the Strait? Drop it in the comments. It's one of the great what-ifs left in naval history.